Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University, Belfast. This is LawPod.
Welcome back, Geoff. It's been a while since we had a chat. I'm interested in your new book as a way into a conversation about just what your latest thinking is about the realm of public policy. I suppose that your underlying thesis in the book is that there's a closure around the public imagination, our ability to reimagine public policy. And I just wonder what your analysis or your thesis is in terms of the origins of that closure before we go on to some of the ways in which to reimagine how we organise and design society and deal with some of these intractable and what some people talk a little bit a poly crisis, where there's obviously very deep interconnections as well, but across areas like ecology and economy. But where does the closure come from? What is your own sense of what we're talking about?
Yeah, well, thanks, Peter. So most of my work is very sort of practical stuff with governments. I'm in an engineering department now. It's all about sort of fixing problems. But I became more and more convinced we had a deeper underlying problem of imaginative closure. And this really struck me shortly before the pandemic, when I spent a lot of time with Friday school strike activists, so young eco-activists around the world, and was really sort of struck how pessimistic they were about any prospect for sort of positive social and political change. And then I started interviewing lots of people in different fields, from politics to civil society to business. And again, they could easily picture ecological disaster or technological futures, but not what might happen to our health service or welfare or democracy. And I became, this is sort of, in a sense, hypothesis one is that there has been some shrinking of that shared imaginative space. As to why it's shrunk, I think there are lots of different reasons. There's a kind of intellectual reason, which is perhaps the disappointment of some of the movements of change, the radical left, the Marxist tradition in the 20th century. There's probably an economic reason that so many people have faced stagnant incomes now for a generation or more in countries like the US and the UK. That means it's always rational to be pessimistic, to assume your kids might be worse off than you are. Obviously, the sense of hitting ecological limits makes us perhaps less confident about the ability to change society, and many other factors. But the reason I wrote the book is, I think one of the reasons is that the institutions which should be helping us to imagine have actually reneged on their role. And that's the key one. So universities, I'm in a university, or one, they do very little in this space for a broad audience. Political parties at various points in history really tried to think 20, 30, 40 years into the future. They're now much more trapped in a kind of eternal present. Social media again, really struggle with any long-term perspective, let alone an imaginative perspective. And weirdly, the arts too. So I've just done another book out this week on the arts and social imagination. Large parts of the arts world have essentially become woven into the consumption patterns of the very rich and fashion, and with very sort of bullshitty stuff about ecology and social change, but not really much serious engagement. So many of the, in a sense, the places, the institutions we often spend public money on to help our society have vacated this space. So there's not the sort of the collective debate about where we might want to get to and how we get there and so on, which perhaps there has been in previous eras.
Just let's stay with that thought about the arts, because it so happens that the School of Law is actually working with creatives and artists across the island. And our underlying thesis is that there's still a role for artistic minds to open up the imagination, that they have a particular role in bringing new things into the world and critiquing and maybe making visible those traps or closures that confront us, especially around the economy. I know that you have some thoughts about how the arts might continue to have that role and how sometimes that role is overstated. Can you summarize that?
Yeah, so this new book, which is really argument is summed up in the title, which is Profits at a Tangent. It says that the arts never really are profits in the classical sense that they tell you where your society is heading. Though often the artists talk about themselves as if they're doing that, but they've actually never done that. But what they do is, at a tangent, exactly as you said, open up new ways of thinking, new ways of feeling, new ways of experiencing. So in relation to the new economy, the arts which explore the nano and the cosmic, help you think about being part of very complex systems in ways which perhaps rational analysis can't do on its own, or they help you think about waste in a different way and circularity and making products of all kinds, or sculptures or artwork using old plastic or rubber or glass or metal. There's an amazing amount happening around AI and data at the moment with the arts, I think, showing things about a data surveillance AI world, which again, you can't quite reach through sort of prose analysis. So I think they've got a vital role in helping us think our way into the future, but they just need to be a bit humbler. Their role is as part of a team, part of a collective, is not the kind of 19th century view of the godlike artist showing the way to the promised land, which you still sometimes get in kind of brochures at festivals, at galleries and so on. That seems to be a really anachronistic way of thinking about the role of the arts, but they are part of our process of rethinking the world.
That's very good. Okay. The part of your conversation recently with Matthew Taylor touched on the bias in the academy, and I suppose in a wider sense around materiality, that we tend to imagine that we're going to engineer, reconfigure the objects rather than actually bring new mental processes or new creative ways of thinking about the world to bear. And that's certainly clear in parts of the university where we're sitting. Sustainable development, the SDGs, can often be dominated by engineering, and then the social sciences are expected to come in and supplement, even act as communicators of the solutions. Where does that bias come from, and are we beginning to address that? Are there any signs that we're moving towards a thick version of reimagining as opposed to the thin version? You've set out some thoughts about that. So there are two questions there really about what we mean by that material bias, and how do we create the conditions within the academy where we're cultivating much thicker versions of change and change processes.
Yeah, I think it's easier for us to get our heads around thinking of the future in terms of stuff, of physical hardware, a city with drones flying around, or new materials, or robots doing all the work. That's kind of quite easy to picture. But if you look at history, although materiality does change everything, what our buildings are like, our transport, in many ways changes of consciousness are more fundamental to historical change, and they're invisible by their nature. And yet in relation to futures, an enormous amount is spent on imagining and designing material futures. So new nanotechnology, new transport things, new battery technologies, and that's all fine. But almost nothing by comparison is spent on mobilizing brain power to try and imagine, what could consciousness be like in 50 or 60 years' time? How will people think and feel and experience? And what I've called in a paper put out about a year ago, exploratory social science, the use of rigorous methods to try and explore things like a zero carbon economy, or a care system for the late 21st century, or reimagining what democracy would look like if you were starting now, not in the 200 years ago. And it seems to me this is one thing where the university should be playing a big role in non-material social imagination to complement the ubiquitous stuff from Hollywood to smart city fairs and so on, which focuses on just the stuff. But we know the stuff on its own doesn't give us a very happy future. And it should be obvious it's both and, not either or.
Yes, it struck me that there's a connection there between the the quality of attention and your interest in mental well-being as well. Isn't there a deep connection between our ability to reimagine and the ways in which the system currently bears down on our ability to apply ourselves, to experiment with our disposition? And in many ways, we are captive to the system that reproduces its own closure because of its impact on our mental health and the space that we have to reimagine how we live and think and care for the self.
Yeah, no, I think there's many dimensions to that. I mean, one of the people I go back to in the book is Viktor Frankl, his very famous study of concentration camp survivors, where he basically shows how vital hope is to survival through hard times. You don't have any sense of hope is not surprising. You are both psychologically and physically weaker. I think we know a lot about agency, how important agency is for mental well-being, and lots of people feel a complete loss of any agency, control over their lives, particularly perhaps if you're under 25 and if you've got no prospect of a decent job, housing, etc., etc. So I think the field you're opening up in that discussion, what is the relationship between mental well-being in the present as well, a line of sight to better futures, is a really important one. And I don't sort of believe it's a particular conspiracy of the system to block that out, but I think it's an effect of many other things systemically which have crushed this space for a sense of creative agency.
Yes. And the other point that Matthew raised, of course, was I'm sure you both are very cognizant of the difficulty that social science and the humanities have in raising the responsibility of our models of capitalism. Insofar as there are vested interests, these traps are reproduced as well. The so-called 1% not only have access to intellectual property, but they have great access to the ways in which the attention economy is managed, and that closure is reproduced through social media and the other parts of the media complex. So are there any signs that we're opening up that question? Are we beginning to name forms of capitalism as the underlying problem here when it comes to reimagining how we might design systems, parts of the social system?
Yeah, so after the financial crash, which is about 15 years ago, I wrote a piece in Prospect magazine with the title After Capitalism, which actually then turned into a book. And I went and asked lots of economists, okay, what's your theory of after capitalism? And not a single orthodox economist can even cope with the question. They have no way of framing it. All of their models and theories essentially assume capitalism will last forever. And so I say to them, come on, that's not plausible. Societies change, they re-emerge, economic systems are never eternal, especially capitalism. So surely you must have some way of thinking about what might be beyond it. And the answer was there was very little. And that book, which was called The Locust and the Bee, in a way was slightly mistimed. I thought there would be a great thinking of evolution beyond capitalism after the crash. But I got the timing wrong. But now there is actually a lot happening around the world, lots of study groups and think tanks, funding from the big US foundations, bizarrely, on new economic thinking. One of the organizations I work with is Demos Helsinki, who've been doing sort of work mapping these alternatives and trying to bring them together to share ideas. I wouldn't say there's anything which is yet the blueprint for alternative to capitalism. In a way, there shouldn't be. That was the sort of old way of thinking, that you'd take over the center of power, and on the next day you would sort of decree communism or socialism, whatever it may be. That's not either desirable or plausible. But I think what these different clusters of work are doing is imagining, for example, commons ownership models for land or for data, different ways of running work, different ways of running care, different ways of integrating ecological thinking into your tax and your regulations. And you add all of those together and you see plausible evolution beyond capitalism. And the metaphor which I've liked is comparing this to monarchy. So 200 years ago, it was thought that monarchy was rooted in human nature, was an inevitable part of our society. It was then thought democracy was something which had been tried and failed. And obviously the world required empires and kings and so on. And what we did in many countries, certainly in Northern Europe, wasn't, in fact, to again cut the heads off the kings and queens. It was to slowly push into the margins of power and relevance. And I think that's a much closer metaphor to what might happen to capitalism. It's not that you'll get rid of all your banks and your markets and so on, but they'll just become slowly less dominant, both in our psyche and in power and in shaping systems, and other alternatives will fill some of that space, but probably over 30, 50, even 100 years rather than in a great big bang revolutionary moment.
Yes, no, I think the space where that seems to be happening is around the issues of growth, economic growth, and the ways we measure that there is a deeper critique emerging even in parts of mainstream academia and so-called, there's new forms of economic political theory reflecting some of these ideas. Can I finish with, you travel to many parts of the world now, and to what extent do you suspect or have a sense that when we identify a certain closure in the imagination, that is very a function of the demise of Western hegemony, really, in terms of the field of ideas, and that we might have to look to other parts of the world to really drive the kinds of changes and reimaginations that you're thinking about?
So the way that was my hope in writing this book, and I did a lot of conversations and hosted sessions with groups around the world, in particularly China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, in a way hoping I would find these sort of radical alternatives. But slightly depressingly, for different reasons in each part of the world, I think there's a parallel kind of closure. So in China, which in many ways is the dominant country of this century, for various reasons, the system is very happy with technological hardware futures, but it's almost impossible to think creatively about society, let alone decision-making. There was much more 10 years ago than there is now. It's become essentially suppressed. And the writers interested in this space don't dare put their heads above the parapet. In India, the main sort of more recent imaginary is very much rooted in Hindutva, in Modi and the BJP's idea of returning to a sort of Hindu worldview and the idea that India invented genetics and all sorts of things, which I find rather backward-looking. Africa, a generation or two ago, had very quite utopian ideas around these ideas like Ujamaa in Tanzania or Ubuntu, these sort of African values which would help to redefine ownership. And again, all of that is pretty much gone. There is confidence in Africa. There's a lot of interest in business and tech, but that sort of social imaginary is again weaker than it was a while ago. So I think we've got a global problem of sort of re-energizing our imagination, and I definitely would expect as that happens, there probably will be more useful ideas coming out of other places. So Taiwan, for example, I think is doing the most amazing work on democracy, far ahead of anywhere in Europe, and we need to learn from their creative imagination. Some of the work, I'm in Bangladesh quite a lot at the moment. They're doing work on thinking about collective intelligence, which is one of my great interests. Again, ahead of anywhere in the North, as it were, North America or Europe. So I think it's very important that we do start with a global bias, an assumption that, as you say, the West is in slow decline. Probably the best ideas won't all come out of Oxford and Cambridge or Harvard or Berlin or whatever. But not to romanticize the conditions elsewhere, which may also be suppressing the ability to think radically.
Great. Geoff, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. That's lovely to get those thoughts.